If Google shut down forever, your phone would still turn on. The screen would still light up. But somewhere between the lock screen and the home screen, a quiet handshake happens with a server in a data center you've never thought about, and if that server is gone, the phone that looks alive is quietly cut off from almost everything it used to do. That's the version of this apocalypse nobody pictures. Not fire, not silence, not a black screen. Just a phone that works fine, technically, while being unable to open half the apps on it. Here's the premise, stated plainly. Every Google product, everywhere, permanently gone. Search, Gmail, Android, Maps, Chrome, Drive, YouTube, Google Cloud, the ad network running quietly behind a huge share of the websites you've never noticed are Google-powered. All of it, off, at once, forever. The obvious answer is that people lose their search engine and switch to Bing. That's the easy answer, and it's wrong. Or at least it's the smallest true thing in a much bigger collapse. Losing Google isn't losing a website. It's losing the plumbing. Start with the first thing that actually breaks, which is not search. It's the small blue button. You know the one. It sits at the bottom of login pages for Spotify, for Duolingo, for your Gyms app, for a dating app you signed up for at 1 a.m. 2 years ago and forgot existed. Sign in with Google. Millions of accounts across the internet were never given their own password. They were given a Google identity instead, because typing a new password felt like effort. And Google was already logged in. The morning Google disappears, none of those buttons do anything. Not wrong password, not account not found, nothing. The handshake it's trying to make simply has no one on the other end. And the people affected don't experience this as Google is down. They experience it as I am locked out of my entire digital life, and I don't remember signing up for half of it under my own name. That's the first ordinary disruption, not a headline. A person standing in their kitchen, trying to log into their electricity provider's app to pay a bill, watching a loading wheel spin over nothing. The second thing to break is quieter and more personal. Identity itself, in the bureaucratic sense. A staggering number of people use one Gmail address as the master key to their entire online existence. Bank alerts, insurance documents, two-factor codes, password reset links, their kids' school portal. Gmail wasn't just email. It was the filing cabinet everything else pointed to. When it's gone, the reset link for your bank account tries to email an address that no longer exists, which means you can't reset the password, which means you can't get into the account that has the reset link for the next thing. It's less a wall and more a hallway of locked doors, where each key is behind the previous door. Android is where the scale becomes visible. A majority of smartphones on Earth run on it, and Android was never really your phone's software. It was Google's software, licensed out, quietly phoning home, for permissions, updates, location services, and app verification. Without Google's servers behind it, an Android phone doesn't explode or die, it degrades. Push notifications stop syncing properly. The Play Store, the only place most of these phones knew how to install anything, sits there listing apps it can no longer deliver. Within a week, a phone that cost someone 4 months of savings starts to feel like a brick with a flashlight app. This is where you start to see who gets stuck and who adapts fast. Apple users barely blink, different ecosystem, different login, mild inconvenience at worst. iPhone sales, which were already strong, start climbing in a way that has nothing to do with a new camera and everything to do with panic-driven upgrades. Meanwhile, budget Android phones, the ones sold specifically because they were cheap and functional, in countries where a $1,000 phone isn't realistic, become the least functional devices on the planet almost overnight. The people with the least money to replace a phone are the ones holding the phones that broke hardest. That's not a coincidence built into the scenario. That's just what happens when critical infrastructure is free, until it isn't there anymore. Maps is its own quiet disaster. And it's not really about tourists getting lost. It's about delivery drivers, rideshare drivers, and logistics companies who built entire businesses on an API that was, for most of its life, treated as basically permanent, like electricity. A driver pulls up their app to start a shift, and the map tile simply doesn't render. Multiply that by however many gig workers route their entire day through turn-by-turn directions. They never memorized because they never had to. Cities that quietly deleted their own paper map culture 20 years ago now have a workforce that doesn't know its own streets without a screen telling it where to turn. Now, the part that doesn't look dramatic, but might be the biggest domino of all, the advertising engine. A huge share of the free internet, blogs, news sites, hobby forums, recipe pages, you scroll past 6 paragraphs of someone's childhood to get to the actual recipe, exists financially because of ads served through Google's ad network. Not flashy banner ads you'd notice. The invisible kind auctioned in milliseconds, funding the entire free content model of the web. When that network goes dark, it's not that ads look worse, it's that the money stops. A small blog that made rent through ad revenue for a decade checks its dashboard and sees 0 permanently with no warning email, because the company that would have sent the warning email doesn't exist anymore either. This is the misconception worth correcting directly. People assume the internet is made of independent websites competing for attention. In practice, a massive percentage of that competition was refereed, funded, and indexed by one company. Google wasn't a player in the game. Google was closer to the stadium, the scoreboard, and the concession stand all at once. Remove it, and you don't just lose one team. You lose the structure that made the game make sense. And there's a layer under that layer. Google Cloud doesn't just power Google's own products. It quietly hosts a significant portion of websites, apps, and back-end services that have nothing to do with Google in the user's mind at all. A food delivery app, a hospital's patient portal, a small SaaS tool a mid-sized company depends on to run payroll. None of these ever say Google anywhere on the screen. Their users would have no idea. But if the servers underneath are gone, the app simply stops working, and the company running it spends its first day not fixing the problem, but figuring out that the problem is even theirs to fix. Here's where the winners start to emerge clearly. Microsoft, which already has Azure, Outlook, Bing, and Windows, becomes the obvious default, not because it's beloved, but because it's the biggest remaining structure, standing in roughly the same shape. Amazon Web Services picks up a wave of migrating companies overnight, at prices that quietly go up the moment demand does. DuckDuckGo, a search engine most people used to think of as the, quote, alternative for paranoid people, becomes, for a few chaotic months, one of the only search engines with servers that can handle the traffic of the entire planet at once. And it visibly buckles under the weight of its own sudden popularity. And then there's a stranger kind of winner. Reference librarians, IT consultants, and the handful of people in every office who still remember how to bookmark a website manually instead of Googling it every single time. For about 2 weeks, competence at finding things without a search bar becomes a genuinely marketable skill, the way knowing how to drive a manual transmission becomes useful exactly once a decade. The password problem deserves its own honest mention. Chrome's built-in password manager quietly stored the login credentials for a huge share of internet users who never used a dedicated password app because typing remember password once was easier than setting one up. When Chrome and its syncing servers vanish, those saved passwords don't necessarily vanish with them, but the sync that kept them updated across a laptop, a phone, and a work computer does. People suddenly discover they don't actually know their own passwords, because they never needed to. The contrarian insight here is uncomfortable. Google didn't just organize the internet for us. It quietly remembered things for us too. And losing that isn't just inconvenient. It's closer to a small distributed memory loss across an entire population. Within a few months, though, the world doesn't collapse. It reorganizes in the slightly worse but functional way large systems tend to. New standalone email providers pick up the users who fled Gmail. Search fragments across 3 or 4 competitors, instead of one dominant one, which, depending on who you ask, is either healthier for the internet or just more annoying. Because now you have to check 2 search engines to get one decent answer. Businesses rebuild logins from scratch, and a whole industry of account recovery consulting appears out of nowhere, charging people to help them reconstruct 20 years of digital identity built on a company that no longer exists. Android phones get a second life through third-party firmware projects that strip out the dependency on Google's servers entirely, clunkier, less polished, but functional, built by exactly the kind of people who'd been complaining about corporate lock-in for years and are now, quietly, correct. The new weird normal a year out looks almost fine on the surface. People have new logins, new habits, new default apps. But there's a specific kind of caution that didn't exist before. Instinct to keep a backup email, a habit of writing down passwords somewhere that isn't a browser, a mild superstition about trusting any one company's login button too completely, which is the real-life mirror this scenario was pointing at the whole time. Most people never think of Google as infrastructure, the same way nobody thinks about the water main until it breaks. It doesn't feel like infrastructure, because it doesn't send you a bill that says infrastructure on it. It feels like a habit, a search bar, a login button, a map on your phone. But somewhere along the way, a huge percentage of the internet quietly agreed to run through one company's servers because it was free and fast, and nobody had to think about it. That's the part this impossible scenario actually reveals. Not that Google is too powerful, or too small, or good, or evil, just that convenience has a way of becoming dependency, without ever asking permission first. And you don't usually notice how much you were leaning on something until the exact moment it's no longer there to lean on.